In the ancient city of Nineveh, during excavations conducted between 1849 and 1851, British archaeologist Austen Layard uncovered what would become one of the most significant literary discoveries in archaeological history. Among the thousands of clay tablets retrieved from the ruins of King Ashurbanipal's library, a series of fragments would eventually reveal humanity's oldest recorded epic narrative. The Epic of Gilgamesh, inscribed in cuneiform script on 12 tablets dating to approximately 700 BC, but preserving traditions that extend back to at least 2700 BC, presents far more than ancient literature. It contains detailed accounts of a historical king whose achievements, relationships, and quest for immortality establish him as the first documented hero in human civilization, yet the precision of geographical descriptions, the consistency of genealogical records, and the correlation with independent archaeological evidence suggest this epic preserves genuine historical memory rather than pure mythology. What makes the Gilgamesh narrative particularly compelling is its systematic documentation across multiple independent sources spanning nearly 2 millennia. Sumerian king lists confirm Gilgamesh as the 5th king of Uruk's first dynasty, reigning sometime during the early dynastic period around 2700 BC. Archaeological excavations at Uruk itself have revealed architectural achievements and urban planning that correspond precisely with accomplishments attributed to Gilgamesh in the epic texts. The walls of Uruk, described in elaborate detail within the narrative, have been located and measured, confirming the epic's technical accuracy regarding their construction and dimensions. This convergence of literary tradition, historical records, and physical evidence establishes Gilgamesh not merely as a legendary figure, but as a genuine historical individual whose deeds were systematically preserved through written tradition across thousands of years. The evidence we are about to examine spans multiple domains of investigation, drawing connections between archaeological discoveries at ancient Mesopotamian sites, linguistic analysis of cuneiform tablets, astronomical references embedded within the narrative, and geological evidence that supports the epic's descriptions of catastrophic flooding. This investigation will demonstrate how the first recorded hero emerged from a civilization whose sophistication and knowledge systems continue to challenge our understanding of early human achievement. The systematic recovery of the Gilgamesh epic represents one of archaeology's most dramatic revelations, transforming our understanding of ancient literature and historical documentation. When Austen Layard began excavating the ancient Assyrian capital of Nineveh in 1849, he encountered the remains of King Ashurbanipal's palace library, a collection that would eventually yield over 30,000 clay tablets covering subjects from astronomy to medicine to literature. Among these fragments, a series of 12 tablets caught the attention of George Smith, a British museum curator who was cataloguing the Nineveh collection during the 1860s and 70s. Smith's translation work revealed portions of a flood narrative that bore striking similarities to the biblical account, creating immediate scholarly and public interest. The initial discovery occurred in circumstances that highlight the challenges of 19th century archaeological recovery. Layard's excavations at the mound of Kuyunjik, the ancient site of Nineveh located across the Tigris River from modern Mosul, focused primarily on recovering monumental sculptures and architectural elements that would impress museum visitors and wealthy patrons. The thousands of clay tablet fragments that filled the palace rooms received less immediate attention, being packed into crates and shipped to the British Museum without systematic documentation of their original contexts. This casual treatment of cuneiform tablets reflected the archaeological priorities of the era, when spectacular visual discoveries took precedence over textual materials whose content remained undecipherable to most excavators. George Smith's involvement transformed this situation dramatically. Smith had taught himself to read cuneiform script while working as an engraver, spending his lunch break studying the displayed tablets at the British Museum. His growing expertise eventually led to employment at the museum, where he was assigned the tedious task of sorting, cleaning, and cataloguing the thousands of fragmentary tablets from Layard's expeditions. In 1872, while examining a broken tablet designated as fragment number 11 from the Gilgamesh series, Smith encountered a passage describing a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. The text described a survivor who built a boat, loaded it with animals and family members, and weathered the catastrophe before the vessel came to rest on a mountain. The implications of this discovery electrified Victorian society. Smith presented his findings to the Society of Biblical Archaeology on December 3, 1872, demonstrating that flood traditions existed in Mesopotamian literature that predated the biblical account by over a millennium. Contemporary reports describe Smith becoming so excited during his initial reading of the flood passage that he jumped up from his desk and began pacing around the room in agitation. The Daily Telegraph newspaper, recognizing the significance of the discovery, funded an expedition for Smith to return to Nineveh to search for missing portions of the tablet. Smith's expedition to Nineveh in 1873 achieved remarkable success despite lasting only a few months. Within days of beginning excavations in the area where Layard had discovered the library tablets, Smith's workers uncovered additional fragments of the Gilgamesh series, including crucial portions of the flood narrative that filled gaps in the story. This extraordinary find demonstrated that significant materials remained at the site despite Layard's earlier work, though the fragmentary condition of the tablets required painstaking scholarly effort to reconstruct the complete narrative. The process of assembling and translating the complete epic extended over decades as scholars identified fragments dispersed across multiple museum collections and gradually pieced together the 12-tablet standard version. The tablets themselves presented numerous challenges for translation. Written in Akkadian cuneiform using a syllabic script that could represent individual sounds or entire words, the texts required intimate knowledge of ancient Mesopotamian languages and extensive comparative study of similar passages from related texts. Many tablets survived in fragmentary condition, with crucial passages missing or too damaged to read with confidence. Different tablets preserved variant readings of specific passages, requiring editorial decisions about which version most accurately represented the original composition. Research revealed that the 12-tablet version from Ashurbanipal's library represented the culmination of a long literary tradition. King Ashurbanipal, who ruled Assyria from 668 to approximately 627 BC, was an unusual monarch who prided himself on his scholarly accomplishments alongside his military victories. He commissioned scribes to collect texts from libraries throughout Mesopotamia, creating a comprehensive archive that preserved much of ancient Near Eastern literature and learning. The scribes copied texts onto standardized tablet formats, creating multiple copies of important works and systematically organizing materials by subject matter. The colophons inscribed on many tablets from Ashurbanipal's library provide crucial information about the text's origins and transmission. These scribal notes identify source texts, name the scribes who perform the copying work, and sometimes include dates and locations where the copying occurred. The Gilgamesh tablets indicate they were copied from earlier Babylonian versions, suggesting the epic had achieved standardized form centuries before Ashurbanipal's time. Some colophons warn against unauthorized alteration of the text, demonstrating ancient concerns about maintaining textual integrity across multiple copying generations. The discovery of additional Gilgamesh fragments at other Mesopotamian sites gradually revealed the epic's widespread popularity and long transmission history. Tablets recovered from Babylonian sites dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BC preserved earlier versions of the epic with significant variations from the standard Assyrian edition. These earlier texts demonstrated that the Gilgamesh tradition had evolved over many centuries, with scribes adding, removing, and modifying episodes while maintaining core narrative elements. The existence of multiple versions across different time periods and geographical locations confirmed that Gilgamesh represented a central figure in Mesopotamian cultural consciousness, rather than an isolated literary creation. The historicity of Gilgamesh receives crucial support from multiple copies of the Sumerian King List, administrative documents that catalogued rulers of ancient Mesopotamian city-states across millennia. The most complete version, preserved on the Weld Blundell prism housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, was acquired by collector Herbert Weld Blundell in 1922 and dates to approximately 1700 BC. This cuneiform document lists Gilgamesh as the fifth king of Uruk's first dynasty, crediting him with a reign of 126 years and identifying his father as Lugalbanda, himself a legendary king and hero. The Sumerian King List represents an extraordinary historical document that attempts to provide comprehensive chronological coverage of Mesopotamian rulership from the beginning of kingship through the compiler's contemporary period. The text begins with the statement that kingship descended from heaven to the city of Eridu, then systematically lists rulers of various cities, providing reign lengths and occasionally noting significant achievements or characteristics. The list distinguishes between antediluvian kings, who ruled before a great flood destroyed civilization, and post-diluvian dynasties that rebuilt urban life after the catastrophe. The reign lengths recorded in the Sumerian King List present one of the document's most puzzling features. Antediluvian kings receive reigns measured in tens of thousands of years, with individual rulers credited with periods of 28,800 years or even 43,200 years. Following the flood, reign lengths become more modest but still extraordinary by normal human standards. Gilgamesh's reign of 126 years falls within this category of extended but not impossibly long reigns, attributed to early post-diluvian rulers. Scholarly interpretation of these extraordinary chronologies has produced various theories attempting to reconcile the numerical data with historical reality. Some researchers propose the numbers represent symbolic values rather than actual year counts, possibly indicating the importance or divine favour associated with particular rulers. Others suggest the figures might represent collective dynasty lengths rather than individual reigns, with single names standing for multiple generations of rulers sharing the same title. Still others point to evidence that ancient Mesopotamian cultures employed different calendar systems at various periods, raising the possibility that reign lengths were calculated using shorter year units that were later misinterpreted as standard solar years. Despite these chronological difficulties, the Sumerian King List's inclusion of Gilgamesh within its systematic framework of historical documentation provides crucial evidence for his genuine existence as a historical ruler. The list identifies specific details that correspond with information from other sources, including his position as fifth king of Uruk's first dynasty, his father's identity as Lugalbanda, and his association with the city's fortification projects. Archaeological research has confirmed the historical existence of several other rulers named in the King List, including figures from later periods whose reigns can be precisely dated through multiple independent sources. Multiple copies of the Sumerian King List survive from different periods and locations, demonstrating that the document represented an important component of Mesopotamian historical consciousness, rather than an isolated composition. Comparison between different versions reveals that scribes updated the list to include contemporary rulers while maintaining consistency in the treatment of earlier dynasties. The persistence of Gilgamesh's inclusion across all surviving versions indicates his recognized status as a significant historical figure rather than a later mythological addition. The King List treatment of Gilgamesh includes formulaic language used consistently throughout the document to describe legitimate rulers who held divinely sanctioned authority. The text states that Gilgamesh's father was a phantom, a curious designation that some scholars interpret as indicating Lugalbanda's deified status by the time later versions of the King List were compiled. The document credits Gilgamesh with building Uruk's walls, directly connecting him with the architectural achievements described so prominently in the epic narrative. Contemporary administrative documents from the early dynastic period provide additional context for understanding the historical background of Gilgamesh's reign. Economic texts from Uruk and surrounding cities document extensive trade networks, sophisticated agricultural systems, and complex administrative hierarchies that characterize Mesopotamian urban civilization during the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BC. These documents confirm that the cultural context described in the Gilgamesh epic matches the archaeological evidence for urban development, technological capability, and social organization during the period when Gilgamesh would have ruled. Archaeological investigation of ancient Uruk, located in modern-day Iraq approximately 300 kilometers south of Baghdad, has revealed architectural achievements that correspond precisely with descriptions found in the Gilgamesh epic. Excavations conducted by German archaeologist Julius Jordan beginning in 1912 uncovered massive defensive walls that encircled the ancient city, matching the epic's detailed descriptions of fortifications built under Gilgamesh's direction. The text describes these walls as constructed from fired brick, a significant technological achievement for the period, and credits Gilgamesh with personally supervising their construction. The walls of Uruk represent one of the most impressive engineering projects documented from the early dynastic period. Archaeological investigation has traced their circuit for nearly 10 kilometers around the ancient city, encompassing an area of approximately 550 hectares that made Uruk the largest urban center in Mesopotamia during its peak occupation. The fortification system consisted of multiple elements, including a massive earthen rampart, a fired brick wall constructed atop the rampart, and defensive towers positioned at regular intervals along the circuit. The construction techniques employed in Uruk's fortifications demonstrate sophisticated understanding of defensive architecture and materials engineering. The earthen rampart, built from soil excavated during the creation of surrounding irrigation canals, provided a broad base that elevated the defensive wall well above the surrounding plain. The fired brick wall constructed atop this rampart required enormous quantities of fuel for the firing kilns and represented a substantial investment in a superior building material. Fired brick offered significant advantages over sun-dried mud brick, including greater resistance to weathering, improved structural strength, and reduced maintenance requirements. Archaeological analysis of the wall construction reveals evidence of systematic planning and quality control that indicates centralized authority directing the project. The fired bricks maintain consistent dimensions throughout the wall circuit, suggesting standardized production methods and centralized manufacturing facilities. The mortar between bricks shows uniform composition and application, indicating trained workforce following established procedures. The wall's foundation demonstrates careful preparation, including compaction, of underlying soils and creation of drainage systems to prevent water damage to the structure. The epic's description of the walls emphasizes their role as Gilgamesh's primary legacy, a permanent monument demonstrating his capabilities and securing his fame for future generations. The narrative includes passages where Gilgamesh himself describes the wall's construction, providing technical details about their composition and inviting inspection of their quality. The text specifies that the wall circuit enclosed not only residential and commercial districts, but also agricultural areas and orchards, creating a self-sufficient defended zone that could withstand extended siege. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed additional aspects of Uruk's fortification system that were not visible through traditional excavation methods. Geophysical surveys using ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry have identified buried portions of the wall circuit and associated defensive features including moats, gates, and tower foundations. These remote sensing techniques provide information about the fortification's complete extent without requiring destructive excavation, enabling better understanding of the overall defensive system. The monumental scale of Uruk's fortifications required organizational capabilities and resource mobilization that indicate sophisticated state-level administration. Calculations based on the measured dimensions of surviving wall sections suggest the project consumed millions of fired bricks produced over many years of continuous industrial activity. The labor force required for brick production, transportation, and wall construction would have numbered in the thousands, necessitating complex systems for worker recruitment, housing, feeding, and coordination. The administrative apparatus capable of managing such a project demonstrates governmental sophistication, matching that described in the epic's portrayal of Gilgamesh's rule. Dating evidence from the wall construction provides crucial chronological context for correlating archaeological remains with the literary tradition. Pottery sherds embedded in the wall's earthen rampart and brick courses enable relative dating through ceramic typology, placing the construction in the early dynastic period consistent with the traditional dating of Gilgamesh's reign. Radiocarbon analysis of organic materials including charcoal from brick firing and wood fragments from gate structures produces absolute dates centering on the late 4th to early 3rd millennium BC, before the standardized Akkadian version discovered at Nineveh. The Gilgamesh tradition existed in fragmentary Sumerian poems that preserve even earlier accounts of the hero king's exploits. 5 separate Sumerian compositions dating to the Old Babylonian period around 2000 BC have been recovered from various sites, each focusing on different episodes from Gilgamesh's career. These include Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven, Gilgamesh and the Land of the Living, the Death of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh and Aga of Kish, and Gilgamesh Enkidu and the Netherworld. The discovery and translation of these Sumerian compositions revolutionized scholarly understanding of the Gilgamesh tradition's development and transmission across millennia. Unlike the integrated narrative found in the standard Akkadian epic, the Sumerian poems exist as independent compositions that focus on single episodes or adventures. Each poem circulated separately in ancient Mesopotamian scribal schools, where apprentice scribes copied them as writing exercises, ensuring their preservation and transmission across generations. The fragmentary survival of multiple copies from different cities demonstrates that these compositions enjoyed widespread popularity throughout Old Babylonian Mesopotamia. Gilgamesh and the Land of the Living represents one of the earliest Sumerian compositions, describing Gilgamesh's journey to distant mountains to cut cedar trees and confront the monster Huwawa who guards the forest. This poem establishes fundamental elements of the Gilgamesh character, including his desire for eternal fame through great deeds, his companionship with Enkidu, and his willingness to challenge supernatural forces. The text provides detailed geographical descriptions of the journey through 7 mountains and emphasizes the practical motivation of obtaining valuable cedar timber for temple construction, alongside the heroic goal of defeating a fearsome monster. The Sumerian version of the Cedar Forest expedition differs in significant details from the later Akkadian account, demonstrating how the tradition evolved through centuries of transmission. The Sumerian text identifies the forest guardian as Huwawa rather than the Akkadian Humbaba, though both names clearly refer to the same figure. The Sumerian version emphasizes Utu, the sun god's assistance during the expedition, while the Akkadian epic gives greater prominence to the goddess Ishtar's involvement. These variations suggest that scribes adapted the tradition to reflect changing religious emphasis and literary tastes while maintaining core narrative elements. Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven presents another episode that would be incorporated into the standard epic, though again with notable differences in detail and emphasis. The Sumerian composition focuses more directly on the conflict between Gilgamesh and the goddess Inanna, the Sumerian equivalent of Akkadian Ishtar. The text describes how Inanna sends the Bull of Heaven to destroy Uruk after Gilgamesh rejects her romantic advances, leading to the combined efforts of Gilgamesh and Enkidu to defeat the destructive creature. The poem includes vivid descriptions of the bull's rampage through the city, and the hero's tactics for overcoming their supernatural opponent. The death of Gilgamesh represents one of the most significant Sumerian compositions for understanding ancient Mesopotamian concepts of mortality and the afterlife. This fragmentary text describes Gilgamesh's death and his reception in the underworld, where he receives honours and responsibilities appropriate to his status as a great king. The poem addresses directly the question of why Gilgamesh, despite his partial divine nature and heroic achievements, must ultimately die like all humans. The text presents the god's explanation that immortality belongs to the divine realm alone, while humans, however exceptional, must accept their mortal nature. Gilgamesh and Aga of Kish preserves what may be a historical kernel concerning political relations between early Mesopotamian city-states. The poem describes a conflict between Gilgamesh's Uruk and the rival city of Kish, ruled by King Aga. The narrative includes political deliberations where Gilgamesh consults with assemblies of elders and young warriors, providing rare glimpses of governmental procedures in early dynastic Mesopotamia. The poem's resolution through negotiation rather than warfare, and its inclusion of what appear to be historical figures, suggest it may preserve genuine political traditions from the period. Gilgamesh Enkidu and the Netherworld presents one of the most mysterious and fragmentary compositions, describing Enkidu's journey to the underworld to retrieve objects that Gilgamesh had lost. The poem includes detailed descriptions of underworld conditions and the proper protocols for visiting the realm of the dead without becoming trapped there. Enkidu violates these protocols and becomes unable to return, leading Gilgamesh to appeal to the gods for his companion's release. The conclusion includes Enkidu's report about conditions in the afterlife, providing crucial information about Sumerian concepts of death and the underworld. The creation and transformation of Enkidu represents one of the epic's most sophisticated narrative elements, embodying fundamental questions about the relationship between nature and civilization that would resonate through subsequent millennia of human thought. The epic describes Enkidu's creation by the goddess Uruk, who fashioned him from clay in response to complaints from Uruk's citizens about Gilgamesh's oppressive behaviour. Enkidu initially lived among wild animals in the wilderness, drinking at waterholes with gazelles and competing with beasts at grazing grounds, representing humanity in its most natural, uncivilized state. The description of Enkidu's wild existence provides remarkable detail about his appearance and behaviour before encountering civilization. The text describes him as covered with hair like a wild animal, with long locks flowing down his back and body hair covering his entire frame. He possessed enormous strength that enabled him to uproot trees and defend animal herds from human hunters. His diet consisted of grass and raw plants like the animals he lived among, and he drank by kneeling at waterholes alongside gazelles and other wild creatures. This portrait emphasizes Enkidu's complete integration into the natural world, living without the trappings of human culture, including language, clothing, tools, or social conventions. The civilizing of Enkidu occurs through the intervention of a temple prostitute named Shamhat, sent from Uruk to seduce him and draw him away from his animal companions. The epic devotes substantial narrative attention to this civilizing process, treating it as a fundamental transformation that cannot be reversed. After spending 6 days and 7 nights with Shamhat, Enkidu discovers that the wild animals no longer accept him as one of their own. When he attempts to run with the gazelles, they flee from him. His strength remains, but it has changed character, no longer suited to life in the wilderness. Shamhat's role in civilizing Enkidu extends beyond the initial seduction to include systematic instruction in human customs and behaviour. She provides him with clothing, dividing her own garments to cover his nakedness, and marking his transition from natural to cultural existence. She teaches him to eat bread and drink beer, the quintessential products of agricultural civilization requiring complex production processes and representing human mastery over nature. The text describes Enkidu's initial reluctance to consume these unfamiliar substances, his gradual acceptance, and finally his enthusiastic embrace of civilized diet. The transformation includes instruction in personal grooming practices that further distance Enkidu from his wild origins. Shamat anoints his body with oil, removing the dirt and wild scent of his previous existence and marking him as a cultured individual. She teaches him to use tools and weapons, replacing his raw, natural strength with the directed force of civilization. Most significantly, she introduces him to human language, enabling communication and social interaction that separate humans from animals regardless of their physical capabilities. The epic presents Enkidu's civilizing as both gain and loss, a theme that adds philosophical depth to what might otherwise be simple narrative of primitive to advanced progression. Enkidu gains knowledge, companionship, and purpose through his transformation, but loses his innocent harmony with nature and his unthinking freedom from moral concerns. His animal companions reject him. Sensing the fundamental change that civilization has wrought, the text suggests that consciousness and culture inevitably separate humans from natural existence, creating a permanent condition of existing between wilderness and city, belonging fully to neither realm. The friendship that develops between Gilgamesh and Enkidu represents the epic's emotional core, demonstrating how civilization creates bonds of affection and loyalty that transcend natural kinship. Their initial meeting occurs as a confrontation when Enkidu blocks Gilgamesh from entering a marriage chamber to exercise his oppressive right to sleep with brides before their husbands. The two engage in titanic wrestling that demonstrates their matched strength and fierce spirits, fighting until they recognize in each other a worthy companion. This violent beginning transforms into deep friendship as each recognizes qualities in the other that complement his own nature. The complementary aspects of their characters become apparent through their contrasting origins and perspectives. Gilgamesh, born to civilization and divine heritage, possesses authority, education, and refined sensibilities, but also arrogance and restless dissatisfaction with mortal limitations. Enkidu, born in wilderness and civilized through experience, brings direct knowledge of nature, practical wisdom about survival, and loyalty uncomplicated by political ambition. Together they form a complete hero whose combined strengths exceed what either could achieve alone. The epic's account of Gilgamesh and Enkidu's journey to the cedar forest to confront the guardian Humbaba demonstrates remarkable geographical precision that corresponds with actual ancient trade routes and resource acquisition patterns. The text describes a journey lasting several days from Uruk toward mountainous regions where valuable cedar timber could be obtained, matching known Mesopotamian expeditions to the Amanus Mountains along the modern Syrian-Turkish border, or potentially the more distant Lebanese mountains where cedars of extraordinary quality grew. The Cedar Forest expedition represents both a practical resource acquisition mission and a heroic quest for eternal fame through extraordinary deeds. Cedar timber held immense value in ancient Mesopotamia, a region largely devoid of substantial native forests. The wood's superior qualities, including resistance to decay, pleasant aroma, and impressive dimensions, made it the preferred material for temple construction, palace roofing, and shipbuilding. Mesopotamian administrative records document extensive trade networks dedicated to obtaining cedar from distant mountain regions, with expeditions requiring substantial investment in personnel, transportation, and diplomatic arrangements with populations controlling access to forest resources. The epic's geographical descriptions correspond closely with the actual topography encountered travelling northwest from Uruk toward the Amanus mountain range. The text describes the journey as requiring multiple days of travel through changing terrain, beginning in the flat alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia and gradually ascending toward mountainous regions. Specific landmarks mentioned in the narrative match features along historical trade routes documented in administrative texts from various periods. The expedition's route would have followed the Euphrates River northward before turning west toward the mountains, a path that minimized water supply challenges and provided access to established settlements where provisions could be obtained. The text specifies that Gilgamesh and Enkidu travelled extraordinarily long distances each day, covering what normally required multiple days of ordinary travel in single marches. While this supernatural element emphasizes the hero's exceptional capabilities, it may also preserve memory of forced march techniques employed by military expeditions and urgent diplomatic missions. Administrative texts from later Assyrian periods document courier systems capable of travelling remarkable distances through relay systems and by pushing human endurance to extreme limits. The epic's exaggeration of this capability fits patterns found throughout the narrative where genuine historical practices are enhanced to heroic proportions. The cedar forest itself receives detailed description that matches characteristics of ancient mountain forests in the Amenas and Lebanese ranges. The epic describes towering trees whose tops reach heaven, creating dense shade that blocks sunlight from reaching the forest floor. The text mentions the forest's extent covering vast mountainous terrain and emphasizes the difficulty of accessing the interior regions where the most valuable timber grew. These descriptions correspond with ancient accounts of cedar forests, whose density and difficult terrain made timber extraction a challenging enterprise, requiring substantial labor forces and specialized equipment. Humbaba's role as guardian of the cedar forest may preserve memory of actual territorial controls that restricted access to valuable timber resources. Ancient Near Eastern kingdoms frequently established fortified outposts in resource-rich regions and employed military forces to regulate access and extract tribute from those seeking to harvest valuable materials. The epic's portrayal of Humbaba as a fearsome supernatural guardian who must be defeated before the forest's resources can be claimed, transforms these practical territorial controls into mythological narrative while preserving the essential dynamic of contested access to valuable resources. The weapons and equipment that Gilgamesh and Enkidu carry on their expedition receive detailed description that demonstrates knowledge of actual military and expedition gear. The text specifies axes weighing multiple talents, a measurement indicating weapons of extraordinary size requiring exceptional strength to wield effectively. These exaggerated specifications follow the epic's pattern of magnifying real capabilities to heroic proportions while maintaining plausible functional descriptions. The mention of specific weapon types, including axes, particularly suited for cutting trees alongside weapons designed for combat, indicates the dual-purpose nature of the expedition as both resource gathering and military operation. Archaeological evidence from ancient Mesopotamian sites confirms the importance of cedar acquisition and the extensive efforts devoted to obtaining this valuable material. Temple construction accounts from various periods document massive expenditures for cedar timber imported from distant mountain regions. The wood's presence in archaeological contexts, including building remains and luxury furniture, demonstrates that despite the significant costs involved, cedar timber was successfully transported across hundreds of kilometers to reach major Mesopotamian cities. The scale of cedar importation documented in texts and archaeological remains confirms that expeditions similar to the one described in the epic represented regular features of Mesopotamian economic activity rather than unique heroic adventures. Embedded within the Gilgamesh narrative are precise astronomical references that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics and calendar systems. The epic's description of Gilgamesh's journey includes specific mentions of stellar configurations and planetary positions that served as navigation markers and timing indicators. During the journey to the cedar forest, the text describes the observation of particular stars and constellations that mark specific times of year, indicating that the journey was undertaken during optimal seasonal conditions. The text's astronomical references employ technical vocabulary that matches terminology found in dedicated Mesopotamian astronomical texts. Specific stars and constellations are identified by their Akkadian names, including designations that correspond to modern astronomical identifications. The epic mentions observations of the positions of these celestial markers relative to the horizon at specific times of night, providing navigation and timing information that would enable travellers to maintain correct direction and estimate the passage of time during their journey. This integration of practical astronomical knowledge into heroic narrative demonstrates how ancient Mesopotamian culture viewed celestial observation as fundamental to successful execution of important expeditions. The journey's timing receives particular emphasis through descriptions of stellar positions that indicate seasonal considerations crucial for successful completion of the mission. The text describes observations of stars rising heliacally at dawn, a phenomenon that ancient astronomers used extensively for calendar regulation and seasonal predictions. These heliacal risings occur when stars become visible just before sunrise, after a period of invisibility due to their proximity to the sun's position. Different stars undergo heliacal rising at different times of year, creating a celestial calendar that marked agricultural seasons, optimal travel periods, and religious festival dates. The epic's description of making camp at sunset and observing the night sky before continuing the journey the following day reflects actual ancient travel practices documented in administrative and military texts. Night travel in unfamiliar terrain posed serious risks including disorientation, injury from unseen obstacles, and vulnerability to wildlife or hostile human groups. Travellers typically made camp at sunset and resumed journeys at dawn, using the nighttime hours for rest and astronomical observations that confirmed their position and direction. The epic's emphasis on these nocturnal observations and the specific stellar configurations observed provides realistic detail that grounds the heroic narrative in practical ancient travel procedures. The text mentions dreams that Gilgamesh experiences during the journey, dreams that contain astronomical imagery and require interpretation by Enkidu. These dream sequences serve narrative functions including building dramatic tension and foreshadowing coming challenges, but they also incorporate astronomical knowledge expressed through symbolic language. The dreams describe falling stars, meteors, and celestial events that correspond to observable phenomena that would have been familiar to ancient audiences. The interpretation of these astronomical dreams as omens predicting the expedition's outcome reflects Mesopotamian celestial divination practices extensively documented in omen texts from various periods. Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge during the early dynastic period when Gilgamesh would have ruled included sophisticated observations and mathematical analysis of celestial movements. Administrative texts from slightly later periods preserve detailed records of planetary positions, lunar phases, and stellar observations that demonstrate systematic long-term monitoring programs. These programs required institutional support, including trained observers, standardized recording procedures, and mathematical techniques for analyzing accumulated data. The astronomical references in the Gilgamesh epic suggest that such programs existed during or before the hero's time, providing the observational foundation for the technical details incorporated into the narrative. The precision of astronomical timing described in the epic corresponds with requirements for successful military and commercial expeditions, documented in later administrative texts. Seasonal considerations affected the availability of water sources, the passability of river fords, weather conditions in mountainous regions, and the readiness of agricultural communities to provide supplies to travelling groups. Expeditions launched at inappropriate seasons risked encountering impassable floods, exhausted water sources, or hostile populations unwilling to provide supplies during periods of agricultural scarcity. The astronomical observations that determined optimal timing represented practical necessities rather than merely symbolic or religious considerations. The episode involving the Bull of Heaven sent by the goddess Ishtar to punish Gilgamesh for rejecting her advances contains astronomical symbolism that corresponds to observable celestial phenomena. Ancient Near Eastern astronomical texts identify the Bull of Heaven with the constellation Taurus, which played a crucial role in Mesopotamian celestial observation and calendar systems. The epic describes the bull's destructive rampage through Uruk and its eventual defeat by Gilgamesh and Enkidu, an account that may preserve memory of astronomical events or seasonal transitions marked by the constellation's movements. Taurus held particular significance in Mesopotamian astronomy due to its position along the ecliptic, the apparent path of the sun through the celestial sphere over the course of a year. The constellation's heliacal rising marked important seasonal transitions in the ancient Mesopotamian calendar. During the 3rd millennium BC, Taurus rose heliacally around the time of the spring equinox, making it a crucial marker for agricultural timing and religious observances. The constellation's prominence in the night sky during certain seasons and its disappearance during others created a natural metaphor for cyclical destruction and renewal that the epic exploits in its narrative. The Bull of Heaven episode occurs in the epic's narrative sequence immediately following Gilgamesh's rejection of Ishtar's romantic proposition. The goddess's anger at this rejection motivates her to request the Bull of Heaven from her father Anu, threatening to break down the gates of the underworld and release the dead if he refuses her demand. This threat compels Anu to release the bull, despite his concerns about the destruction it will cause. The bull descends to Earth and immediately begins devastating Uruk's countryside, killing hundreds of young men with its first 2 snorts and creating massive craters that trap and kill additional victims. The description of the bull's destructive power emphasizes its supernatural nature, while maintaining enough realistic detail to create vivid imagery. The text specifies that each time the bull snorts, it creates chasms in the earth wide enough to trap large numbers of men. These chasms kill 200 young men with the bull's first snort and 200 more with its second. The 3rd snort nearly catches Enkidu himself, but he manages to avoid falling into the chasm and instead leaps onto the bull's back, seizing it by the horns. This action enables Gilgamesh to strike the fatal blow, plunging his sword into the bull's neck between the horns and base of skull. The combat sequence demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how to fight large aggressive animals, knowledge that would have been familiar to ancient audiences from practical experience with cattle. Enkidu's technique of controlling the bull by gripping its horns matches methods used in ancient bull wrestling and cattle handling. Activities documented in artistic representations and administrative texts dealing with livestock management. Gilgamesh's strike to the vulnerable neck region represents optimal targeting for quick kill, demonstrating practical knowledge of animal anatomy. The astronomical interpretation of this episode gains support from the timing of events within the epic's narrative structure, and from parallel passages in related mythological texts. The bull's descent from heaven and subsequent return after its death creates a celestial cycle that matches the appearance and disappearance of Taurus from the night sky. The emphasis on the bull's destructive power, followed by its defeat and dismemberment, corresponds to seasonal transitions that ancient agricultural societies experienced as alternating periods of danger and relief, as weather patterns shifted through annual cycles. The aftermath of the Bull of Heaven's defeat includes details that strengthen astronomical interpretation. Gilgamesh and Enkidu present the bull's heart to the sun god Shamash, an offering that connects the episode directly to solar symbolism and celestial observations. Ishtar appears on Uruk's walls to curse the heroes for killing the bull, prompting Enkidu to tear off the bull's right thigh and throw it at her. This dismemberment and distribution of the bull's parts may preserve symbolic representation of the constellation's division into recognized asterisms that ancient astronomers used for detailed stellar position tracking. The detailed description of Enkidu's illness and death reveals sophisticated understanding of disease progression and medical observation that characterize Mesopotamian medical knowledge. The epic describes Enkidu's suffering through specific symptoms that unfold over a 12-day period, including fever, weakness, and progressive deterioration that medical historians recognize as consistent with serious infectious disease. The text's precision in documenting the timeline and symptoms of Enkidu's decline suggests the epic's authors had access to detailed medical knowledge and possibly recorded observations of actual disease cases. The illness begins immediately following Enkidu's involvement in killing the Bull of Heaven and his role in defeating Humbaba, actions that angered the gods and led to divine council deliberations about appropriate punishment. The gods decree that one of the two heroes must die for these transgressions, selecting Enkidu rather than Gilgamesh due to the latter's partial divine heritage. This divine judgment manifests as disease rather than immediate supernatural destruction, reflecting Mesopotamian understanding that illness represented divine punishment, while also following observable natural progression. The epic's account of Enkidu's illness emphasizes his gradual awareness of impending death and his psychological responses to this realization. Initially, Enkidu experiences disturbing dreams that he recognizes as omens predicting his doom. These dreams employ symbolic imagery, including visions of the underworld and its conditions, providing detailed descriptions of the realm of the dead that reflect Mesopotamian religious beliefs about the afterlife. The dream sequences allow the epic to explore Enkidu's emotional journey from denial through anger to eventual acceptance of mortality. The physical symptoms of Enkidu's illness receive systematic description that demonstrates medical observation skills. The text indicates that Enkidu takes to his bed and remains there throughout his illness, suggesting weakness and debilitation that prevented normal activity. He experiences fever, indicated by references to his burning condition and the measures taken to provide cooling comfort. The progressive wasting of his physical strength is emphasized through descriptions of how his once mighty body becomes weak and helpless. The text specifies that his condition deteriorates steadily over 12 days, providing a precise timeline that matches patterns observed in various serious infectious diseases. Mesopotamian medical texts from various periods document sophisticated diagnostic procedures and disease classification systems that enabled physicians to track illness progression and predict outcomes. Medical omen texts describe correlations between specific symptoms, their sequence of appearance, and likely disease outcomes. These diagnostic texts demonstrate that Mesopotamian physicians understood diseases following predictable patterns rather than random processes. The precision with which the Gilgamesh epic documents Enkidu's illness suggests familiarity with this medical knowledge and possibly consultation with medical texts or practitioners during the epic's composition. The emotional and psychological dimensions of Enkidu's decline receive as much narrative attention as the physical symptoms. The text presents extensive passages where Enkidu curses those responsible for his civilizing and thus his current suffering, including the trapper who first discovered him and the temple prostitute Shamat who civilized him. These curses reveal Enkidu's anguish at facing death and his bitter regret for having left his innocent wild existence. The sun god Shamash intervenes to remind Enkidu of the benefits civilization brought him, including his friendship with Gilgamesh and the honors he has received, prompting Enkidu to reverse his curses and bless Shamat instead. Gilgamesh's response to Enkidu's illness demonstrates the depth of their friendship and provides insight into ancient Mesopotamian attitudes toward death and mourning. The text describes Gilgamesh sitting beside Enkidu throughout his illness, touching his heart to feel its beating and monitoring his breathing. These actions reflect both personal devotion and practical medical monitoring that attempted to track the patient's condition. Gilgamesh refuses to accept the inevitability of Enkidu's death, desperately seeking divine intervention or medical remedies that might save his friend. The moment of death receives careful description that emphasizes its finality and Gilgamesh's inability to prevent it despite his heroic capabilities. The text describes how Gilgamesh touches Enkidu's heart and finds it no longer beating, marking the precise moment when life departs. The epic emphasizes that Gilgamesh covers Enkidu's face with a veil like that of a bride, a gesture that reflects Mesopotamian burial customs, while also symbolizing the permanent separation death creates. This image of the veiled face recurs in the epic's later passages, describing Gilgamesh's own confrontation with mortality. The elaborate mourning rituals that follow Enkidu's death provide detailed information about ancient Mesopotamian funeral practices and beliefs about proper treatment of the deceased. Gilgamesh tears his clothing and hair. Traditional signs of mourning documented across ancient Near Eastern cultures. He orders the construction of a statue honouring Enkidu and arranges elaborate funeral offerings including precious materials and symbolic objects meant to accompany and assist the deceased in the underworld. These offerings reflect beliefs about continued existence after death and the ability of the living to provide for the dead through proper ritual procedures. The 11th tablet of the epic contains one of the most significant flood narratives in ancient literature, predating the biblical account and providing crucial independent confirmation of catastrophic flooding traditions preserved across multiple ancient cultures. When Gilgamesh reaches Utnapishtim, the sole survivor of the Great Flood who has been granted immortality by the gods, he hears a detailed account of the deluge that destroyed previous civilization. Utnapishtim describes receiving warning from the god Ea about the Divine Council's decision to flood the earth, along with specific instructions for constructing a boat to preserve his family and representatives of all living creatures. The flood narrative's position within the larger epic serves multiple functions, including providing crucial information about mortality and immortality, while also preserving an independent tradition of catastrophic environmental destruction that correlates with geological evidence and global flood traditions. Gilgamesh travels to the ends of the earth seeking Utnapishtim specifically because this figure achieved immortality, the ultimate goal of Gilgamesh's quest following Enkidu's death. The journey itself requires traversing dangerous territories, including regions of complete darkness, and crossing the waters of death, obstacles that emphasize the extraordinary nature of what Gilgamesh seeks to accomplish. Utnapishtim's account begins with description of the Divine Council's deliberations about humanity's fate. The gods decide to destroy humanity through a great flood, though the text provides limited explanation for this drastic decision, beyond references to human noise disturbing divine rest. The god Ea, who had previously created humanity and maintained protective interest in human welfare, opposes the destruction, but cannot openly defy the council's decision. Instead, Ea communicates the warning to Utnapishtim through indirect means, speaking to the reed walls of Utnapishtim's house and instructing him to build a boat and abandon his possessions to save his life. The instructions for boat construction that Utnapishtim receives include remarkably specific technical details that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of naval architecture. Ea specifies exact dimensions for the vessel, describing it as a cube with sides measuring 120 cubits, equivalent to approximately 60 meters. This unusual cubic design would create an extremely stable platform unlikely to capsize even in violent waters, though at the expense of any capability for directed navigation. The design prioritizes survival during catastrophic flooding over any capacity for steering or propulsion, indicating that the vessel was conceived purely as a floating refuge rather than a navigable ship. The construction specifications include details about waterproofing methods that employed materials and techniques documented in ancient Mesopotamian shipbuilding texts. Utnapishtim describes coating the boat's interior and exterior with bitumen, a natural petroleum product abundant in certain regions of Mesopotamia and widely used for waterproofing applications. The text specifies the quantities of bitumen used, indicating application in thick protective layers that would seal joints and prevent water infiltration. Additional waterproofing employed oils and resins that enhanced the bitumen's protective qualities and helped maintain its effectiveness across the duration of the flood. The loading of the boat receives systematic description that emphasizes preservation of comprehensive biological diversity alongside Utnapishtim's family and possessions. The text indicates that Utnapishtim brought aboard representatives of all living things, including wild animals, domesticated livestock, and craftsmen whose skills would be necessary for rebuilding civilization after the flood. The inclusion of craftsmen alongside animals demonstrates sophisticated understanding that cultural knowledge and technical capabilities required preservation alongside biological species if civilization was to continue. Utnapishtim's description of the boat he constructed to survive the flood includes remarkably precise technical specifications that demonstrate advanced understanding of naval architecture and engineering principles. The text provides exact measurements for the vessel, describing it as a cube with sides measuring 120 cubits, equivalent to approximately 60 meters. This unusual cubic design would have created an extremely stable floating structure, maximizing volume while minimizing the risk of capsizing in turbulent waters. The cubic configuration represents a sophisticated solution to the specific challenge of surviving catastrophic flooding without requiring navigation capabilities. Unlike conventional ship designs that optimize for directed movement through water, the flood vessel prioritized stability and volume in a structure that would simply float wherever currents carried it. Naval architecture analysis confirms that cubic vessels possess exceptional stability characteristics, remaining upright even when subjected to extreme wave action that would capsize more conventional hull designs. The lack of streamlining that makes such vessels impractical for normal navigation becomes irrelevant when the goal is purely survival during catastrophic environmental conditions. The internal structure of the vessel receives detailed description that reveals sophisticated understanding of load distribution and structural reinforcement. Utnapishtim describes dividing the interior into 7 levels, each subdivided into 9 compartments, creating 63 separate spaces within the overall structure. This compartmentalization served multiple practical functions, including organizing the storage of different categories of supplies and animals, preventing the entire cargo from shifting dangerously during turbulent conditions, and creating redundant flotation chambers that would keep the vessel afloat even if some compartments were breached. The construction materials specified in the text correspond with those documented in ancient Mesopotamian shipbuilding and construction texts. The primary structural material consisted of timber, though the text does not specify the wood species used. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian boat remains suggests that various woods were employed depending on availability and specific functional requirements, with date palm wood commonly used for smaller vessels and imported cedar, or other hardwoods employed for structures requiring greater strength. The massive scale of Utnapishtim's vessel would have required enormous quantities of timber, representing substantial economic investment and organizational effort. The waterproofing procedures described in the text demonstrate detailed technical knowledge of materials and application methods that would ensure the vessel's integrity during extended exposure to water. Utnapishtim specifies that he used 3,600 measures of bitumen for waterproofing the exterior and 3,600 measures of oil for the interior. These quantities indicate thorough coverage that would create thick protective layers resistant to water infiltration. The text precision in specifying these amounts suggests the measurements derive from actual construction knowledge rather than arbitrary narrative invention. The application of bitumen required heating the material to achieve proper viscosity for effective coating. Ancient Mesopotamian texts describing bitumen used in various construction applications provide instructions for heating procedures and application techniques that would create durable waterproof barriers. The combination of bitumen with oil mentioned in the flood account matches waterproofing formulations documented in construction manuals, where oil served to improve bitumen's adhesion and flexibility. This technical accuracy in describing waterproofing procedures indicates the epic preserves genuine construction knowledge rather than vague mythological descriptions. The timeline for vessel construction provides additional realistic detail that grounds the narrative in practical building requirements. Utnapishtim describes completing the construction in 7 days, a period that seems impossibly brief for such a massive project, but may reflect compressed narrative time rather than actual construction duration. Alternative interpretations suggest the 7 days might represent 7 working periods of unspecified length, or that the number 7 carries symbolic significance while actual construction required extended time. Regardless of the precise duration, the text emphasizes the urgency of the project and the extraordinary effort required to complete it before the flood commenced. The loading procedures described in the text reveal sophisticated understanding of cargo management and preservation requirements. Utnapishtim specifies bringing aboard all his silver and gold, indicating that valuable portable wealth would enable economic recovery after the flood. The inclusion of family members, skilled craftsmen, and all species of animals demonstrates systematic planning for civilization's restoration. The text indicates that loading required careful organization to ensure essential supplies and living creatures were properly distributed across the vessel's compartments, preventing dangerous concentration of weight that could compromise stability. The flood narrative preserved in the Gilgamesh epic corresponds chronologically and descriptively with geological evidence for catastrophic flooding events associated with the Younger Dryas climate period. The Younger Dryas, occurring between 12,900 and 11,700 years ago, represents one of the most dramatic climate shifts in recent geological history, marked by rapid environmental changes and significant flooding as glacial ice melted. The flood account's description of waters rising to cover mountains and the destruction of all human habitation matches the scale of inundation that would have resulted from massive glacial melt events. The Younger Dryas period's onset occurred with remarkable rapidity, with paleoclimate evidence indicating that temperatures in some regions dropped by up to 15 degrees Celsius within a single human generation. This dramatic cooling interrupted the gradual warming trend that had characterized the preceding millennia, plunging much of the northern hemisphere back into near-glacial conditions. The causes of this climate reversal remain debated among climatologists, with competing theories attributing it to various factors including cosmic impact events, volcanic eruptions, or disruptions in ocean circulation patterns. The termination of the Younger Dryas occurred even more abruptly than its onset, with evidence from ice cores indicating that temperatures rose dramatically within periods as brief as several decades. This rapid warming triggered massive melting of glacial ice that had accumulated during the cold period, releasing enormous quantities of water into river systems and oceans. The scale of this glacial melting would have caused catastrophic flooding in river valleys and coastal regions worldwide, creating conditions that matched the destruction described in the Gilgamesh flood narrative and similar accounts preserved in other ancient traditions. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian sites documents a cultural discontinuity during the early dynastic period that corresponds with major flooding events. Excavations at multiple locations, including Uruk, and Kish, have revealed thick, sterile clay layers separating earlier occupation levels from later cultural deposits. These flood layers, while not uniform in thickness or extent across all sites, demonstrate that significant inundation events affected broad regions of southern Mesopotamia during periods that could correspond with the traditional dating of the Gilgamesh flood narrative. The famous flood layer at discovered by Leonard Woolley during excavations in the 1920s, provides particularly dramatic evidence for catastrophic inundation. Woolley's excavations revealed a clean clay deposit approximately 2.5 meters thick, separating earlier Ubaid period occupation from later materials. The thickness and geographical extent of this deposit led Woolley to initially interpret it as evidence for the biblical flood, though subsequent analysis revealed it resulted from localized rather than global flooding. Nevertheless, the deposit confirms that catastrophic flooding events affected ancient Mesopotamian populations and would have created conditions supporting flood traditions and cultural memory. The geographical details in Utnapishtim's account include descriptions of the flood's extent and the vessel's eventual resting place that correspond with actual topographical features. The text describes the waters rising to cover all mountains and destroy all human habitation, imagery that matches the catastrophic scale of major glacial melt flooding. The specification that the boat came to rest on Mount Nemosh provides a specific geographical anchor that researchers have attempted to identify with actual mountain locations. Various candidates have been proposed, including ranges in northern Mesopotamia and surrounding regions where a large floating vessel might plausibly have been deposited as floodwaters receded. The duration of the flood receives precise specification in the text, with Utnapishtim describing specific time periods for different phases of the deluge. The text indicates that the storm lasted 6 days and 7 nights before subsiding, followed by an additional period during which waters gradually receded. These temporal markers provide a framework that distinguishes different stages of the catastrophe and allows for correlation with geological evidence about flooding timelines. The systematic documentation of these time periods suggests the account preserves memory of an actual event, whose progression was carefully observed and recorded. The biological implications of the flood narrative demonstrate understanding of species preservation requirements and ecological recovery processes. The text's emphasis on bringing representatives of all living creatures aboard the vessel reflects recognition that biological diversity required active protection if ecosystems were to recover after catastrophic environmental destruction. This understanding of conservation necessity appears remarkably sophisticated for ancient literature, and may indicate that flood survivors actually did face challenges of restoring plant and animal populations in flood-devastated regions. The post-flood world described in the narrative includes references to changed environmental conditions that correspond with climate shifts documented in geological records. Utnapishtim's account mentions that the gods smelled the sweet savour of his sacrifice after the flood, suggesting that normal atmospheric conditions had been disrupted during the catastrophe. The description of the earth as transformed by the flood's effects matches evidence for major environmental changes that accompanied the Younger Dryas termination and subsequent warming period. Utnapishtim's revelation about the plant of immortality that grows at the bottom of the ocean demonstrates sophisticated botanical knowledge and possibly preserves memory of actual medicinal plants with life-extending properties. The epic describes this plant as having thorns like a rose and the ability to restore youth to whoever consumes it. Gilgamesh successfully retrieves the plant by tying stones to his feet and walking along the ocean floor, but loses it when a serpent steals and consumes it while Gilgamesh bathes in a pool during his return journey. The plant's description includes specific physical characteristics that distinguish it from ordinary vegetation and suggest comparison with actual botanical specimens. The mention of thorns like a rose indicates protective spines that would make harvesting the plant dangerous without proper precautions. This detail adds realism to the account while also creating symbolic resonance with the broader theme that immortality, like the thorned plant, comes at a price and involves risk. The specification that the plant grows at the ocean's bottom places it in an extremely challenging location to access, emphasizing the extraordinary nature of what Gilgamesh attempts to obtain. The retrieval technique described in the text demonstrates practical understanding of underwater diving principles employed in ancient pearl diving and underwater resource harvesting. Tying stones to one's feet to descend to the ocean floor represents an actual method documented in various ancient cultures for achieving sufficient negative buoyancy to reach underwater targets. The technique requires careful calculation of weight needed to overcome natural buoyancy, while maintaining ability to release the weights and return to the surface. Gilgamesh's successful use of this method confirms his exceptional physical capabilities while also grounding the narrative in realistic technical procedures. The plant's properties receive description that matches characteristics attributed to various medicinal plants in ancient pharmaceutical texts. The ability to restore youth suggests rejuvenating effects that ancient physicians associated with certain herbs and preparations. Mesopotamian medical texts document extensive pharmacological knowledge, including identification of plants with specific therapeutic properties and formulations combining multiple ingredients to achieve desired effects. The plant of immortality described in the epic may represent idealized or exaggerated versions of actual medicinal plants known for health-promoting properties. The loss of the plant to a serpent introduces a crucial narrative element that explains why immortality remains beyond human reach, despite Gilgamesh's successful retrieval of the means to achieve it. The serpent's theft occurs when Gilgamesh stops to bathe in a pool during his return journey to Uruk, attracted by the plant's fragrance. The snake consumes the plant and immediately sloughs its skin, demonstrating the plant's rejuvenating power while simultaneously denying it to Gilgamesh. This episode explains through mythological narrative why serpents possess the ability to renew themselves through skin shedding, while humans inexorably age toward death. The symbolic significance of the serpent's acquisition of renewal capacity resonates with widespread ancient associations between snakes and regeneration or immortality. The visible phenomenon of snakes shedding their skins and emerging apparently renewed created natural foundations for these symbolic connections. The epic's explanation for this natural phenomenon through narrative about lost human immortality addresses fundamental questions about why humans alone among creatures seem to lack natural mechanisms for self-renewal and rejuvenation. Gilgamesh's response to losing the plant demonstrates his growth in wisdom and acceptance of mortality that represents the epic's ultimate resolution. Rather than raging against this final denial of immortality or attempting to retrieve another specimen, Gilgamesh weeps for what he has lost and recognizes the futility of his quest. This acceptance marks a crucial transformation from the young king who rejected mortality's constraints to the mature ruler who understands that human achievements must be measured within mortal limitations rather than through impossible quests for divine attributes. The journey back to Uruk following the plant's loss provides opportunity for reflection on what Gilgamesh has learned through his extended quest. The text indicates that he returns by the same route he travelled to reach Utnapishtim, covering once again the enormous distances and traversing the dangerous territories that separated the immortal flood survivor from the mortal world. This return journey represents both physical travel and symbolic passage from the realm where immortality exists to the human world where death remains inevitable. The epic's conclusion, which describes Gilgamesh's return to Uruk and his contemplation of the city's walls and achievements, provides specific architectural details that correspond precisely with archaeological discoveries at the ancient site. The text describes Uruk as covering a specific area that matches excavated evidence, including dimensions for the city wall, the temple district, and residential areas. Gilgamesh invites the ferryman Ushanabi to inspect these accomplishments, describing in detail the fired brick construction, the temple foundations, and the overall urban planning. The return to Uruk marks Gilgamesh's acceptance that immortality lies not in escaping death, but in creating lasting achievements that will be remembered and used by future generations. The walls that Gilgamesh built, the temples he constructed, and the city he developed represent the proper form of immortality available to humans, living on through their beneficial impacts on civilization, rather than through impossible bodily immortality. This philosophical resolution provides satisfying closure to the quest narrative, while articulating sophisticated understanding of how human mortality should be confronted. The description of Uruk's dimensions and layout in the epic's final tablet corresponds remarkably well with archaeological evidence from the actual site. The text specifies that the city encompasses 1 square league, equivalent to approximately 55 square kilometres, matching the area enclosed by the defensive walls traced through excavation. The division of this area into distinct zones, including residential districts, temple precincts, and agricultural land, reflects actual urban planning principles documented at Uruk and other Mesopotamian cities. This precision in geographical and architectural detail indicates the epic preserves accurate information about the historical city rather than vague mythological descriptions. The emphasis on fired brick construction receives particular attention in the text's final passages, with Gilgamesh specifically drawing Urshanabi's attention to the quality of the brickwork and the durability of the construction. The text's pride in fired brick technology reflects the significant achievement this represented in ancient Mesopotamian building practice. Fired bricks required substantially more effort and resources to produce than sun-dried mud bricks, involving fuel for kilns, controlled firing processes, and skilled labour to ensure consistent quality. The investment in fired brick for Uruk's walls demonstrated both the city's wealth and its commitment to creating permanent monuments. The Temple of Eanna receives specific mention in the epic's conclusion, described as occupying a substantial portion of the city's area and representing a major architectural achievement. Archaeological excavations at Uruk have revealed extensive remains of the Eanna precinct, confirming its prominence in the ancient city's layout. The temple complex evolved through multiple construction phases, with each generation of rulers adding to and modifying the sacred structures. The epic's attribution of temple construction to Gilgamesh corresponds with building traditions documented at the site, though determining which specific construction phases might date to Gilgamesh's reign remains challenging. The invitation to Urshanabi to inspect the city's achievements serves narrative functions beyond simple description. Urshanabi, as ferryman who had served the immortal Utnapishtim, represents a link to the divine realm and to the immortality that Gilgamesh sought unsuccessfully. By showing Urshanabi the mortal achievements of Uruk's walls and temples, Gilgamesh demonstrates that he has found appropriate outlets for his heroic ambitions within mortal limitations. The ferryman's presumed appreciation for these accomplishments validates Gilgamesh's final acceptance of mortality and his redirection of energy toward achievable goals. The archaeological confirmation of details described in the epic strengthens arguments for the text's historical foundation. The precision with which the epic describes Uruk's layout, the accurate specifications of wall dimensions and construction materials, and the correspondence between textual descriptions and excavated remains all suggest that significant portions of the narrative preserve genuine historical information rather than pure invention. This historicity extends beyond simple geographical accuracy to include technological details, construction techniques, and urban planning principles that characterized actual ancient Mesopotamian civilization. The preservation of these architectural details through oral transmission and later written recording demonstrates the importance Mesopotamian culture placed on maintaining accurate information about significant achievements. The epic functioned not only as entertainment or religious text, but also as a repository of historical knowledge about the city's development and the accomplishments of its legendary king. This historical function helps explain the text's careful attention to technical specifications and precise measurements that might seem excessive in purely literary narrative. The Gilgamesh narrative establishes patterns that appear in hero traditions across multiple ancient cultures, suggesting either cultural transmission or universal human responses to similar historical circumstances. The hero's superhuman strength, divine ancestry, quest for immortality, defeat of monsters, and ultimate acceptance of mortality appear in Greek traditions surrounding Heracles, in Egyptian accounts of divine kings, in Indian epics describing warrior heroes, and in numerous other cultural contexts. The comparative analysis of hero traditions reveals both striking parallels and significant variations that illuminate how different cultures adapted common themes to local circumstances and values. The superhuman strength attributed to Gilgamesh finds close parallels in Greek accounts of Heracles, whose physical power enabled him to complete the 12 labours and overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Both heroes trace partial divine ancestry that explains their exceptional capabilities while maintaining enough humanity to face mortality and its associated struggles. The tension between divine and human aspects of their nature creates dramatic possibilities that multiple traditions exploit through different narrative strategies. The quest for immortality represents a particularly widespread element in hero traditions that appears in various forms across cultures. Gilgamesh's journey to find Utnapishtim parallels Greek accounts of heroes seeking the golden apples of the Hesperides or attempting to retrieve figures from the underworld. Egyptian pharaonic traditions incorporated elaborate procedures for achieving immortality through proper mummification and provision of tomb equipment, reflecting different cultural approaches to the universal human concern about death's finality. Indian epics describe various methods including meditation, divine intervention, and consumption of soma that could grant extended life or freedom from death's cycle. The defeat of monsters and supernatural opponents appears as a central element in hero narratives across cultures, serving functions beyond simple adventure storytelling. Gilgamesh's confrontation with Humbabar in the cedar forest parallels Heracles' defeat of the Nemean lion, Perseus's beheading of Medusa, and countless other examples from diverse traditions. These monster-slaying episodes demonstrate the hero's exceptional courage and capability, while also symbolizing civilization's triumph over chaotic natural forces. The monsters often guard valuable resources or threaten human communities, making their defeat practically beneficial as well as symbolically significant. The relationship between heroes and divine beings varies across traditions in ways that reflect different theological frameworks and cultural values. Gilgamesh's conflicts with Ishtar demonstrate tensions between human heroes and gods, who demand respect and submission. Greek heroes similarly navigate complex relationships with Olympian deities, who assist, oppose, or test them depending on divine whims and the hero's choices. Egyptian traditions present pharaohs as divine or semi-divine figures whose relationship with gods involves less conflict than mutual cooperation in maintaining cosmic order. The companion figure who accompanies the hero appears frequently across traditions, serving narrative and thematic functions that transcend cultural boundaries. Enkidu's role as Gilgamesh's companion parallels various helper figures in other traditions, including Theseus's companion Pirataus, the Pandavas' relationships in the Mahabharata, and numerous other examples. These companions provide emotional support, practical assistance in achieving heroic goals, and opportunities for exploring themes of friendship, loyalty, and loss. The death of the companion often serves as catalyst for the hero's transformation or quest, as Enkidu's death motivates Gilgamesh's search for immortality. The epic consistently emphasizes Gilgamesh's mixed divine and human nature, describing him as 2/3 god and 1/3 human, a mathematical formulation that suggests sophisticated understanding of heredity and genetic inheritance. This unusual proportion results from his mother Ninsun being a goddess, while his father Lugalbanda, though deified after death, was originally human. The epic attributes Gilgamesh's extraordinary strength, wisdom, and extended lifespan to this divine heritage. The mathematical precision of the 2/3 divine formulation presents interpretive challenges that scholars have addressed through various approaches. The fraction cannot result from simple biological inheritance if one parent is fully divine and the other fully human, which would produce offspring exactly half divine. The epic specification of 2/3 divine status suggests either that Lugalbanda possessed some divine heritage himself, creating a more complex genealogical calculation, or that the formulation represents symbolic, rather than strictly biological quantification of Gilgamesh's exceptional nature. Ancient Mesopotamian texts describe various categories of beings occupying positions between fully divine and fully human status. The Apkallu, or 7 sages who brought civilization to humanity before the flood, represent one such category. Described as possessing divine wisdom while living among humans and teaching essential skills. Kings and heroes who performed extraordinary deeds might be partially deified during life, or fully deified after death, creating a continuum between mortal and divine status rather than absolute binary categories. Gilgamesh's 2/3 divine proportion places him firmly toward the divine end of this spectrum, while maintaining enough humanity to remain subject to mortality. The physical manifestations of Gilgamesh's divine heritage receive detailed description throughout the epic. The text emphasizes his exceptional height and strength, describing him as standing taller than ordinary men and possessing the power to perform feats impossible for normal humans. His ability to travel enormous distances in single days, to wield weapons of extraordinary weight, and to defeat supernatural opponents demonstrates capabilities that transcend human limitations. Yet these superhuman abilities coexist with human vulnerabilities, including the capacity to suffer, to grieve, and ultimately to die. The psychological dimensions of Gilgamesh's hybrid nature create internal conflicts that drive much of the epic's narrative tension. His divine heritage generates ambitions and desires that exceed mortal limitations, including his quest for eternal fame and his eventual search for immortality itself. His human nature subjects him to mortality's constraints and to emotional attachments that divine beings supposedly transcend. This tension between divine aspirations and human limitations creates a character of remarkable complexity, who struggles with fundamental questions about identity, purpose, and the meaning of mortal existence. Ninsen's role as Divine Mother provides Gilgamesh with access to divine knowledge and intercession that proves crucial at several points in the narrative. When Gilgamesh prepares for the journey to the cedar forest, Ninsen performs rituals and appeals to the sun god Shamash to protect her son during the dangerous expedition. Her ability to communicate directly with other deities and to perform effective ritual interventions demonstrates active divine involvement in Gilgamesh's career rather than merely passive transmission of divine genetic heritage. Lugalbanda's status presents more ambiguity in the textual tradition. The Sumerian King List identifies him as a king of Uruk and Gilgamesh's father, while separate Sumerian poems describe Lugalbanda's own heroic adventures, including a journey to distant mountains where he encounters divine beings. Some texts suggest Lugalbanda achieved divine status through his exceptional deeds, rather than being born divine, creating a pattern of earned divinity that contrasts with inherited divine nature. This distinction between achieved and inherited divinity adds complexity to Gilgamesh's own divine heritage. The extended lifespan attributed to Gilgamesh and credited to his divine ancestry corresponds with patterns found throughout ancient Mesopotamian king lists, where early rulers receive extraordinarily long reigns. The Sumerian king list credits Gilgamesh with a reign of 126 years, a period that exceeds normal human lifespan but falls far short of the multi-millennial reigns attributed to antediluvian kings. This intermediate position matches Gilgamesh's 2/3 divine status, suggesting that partial divinity conferred proportionally extended life without granting full immortality. The wisdom attributed to Gilgamesh represents another manifestation of his divine heritage that shapes his character and accomplishments. The epic's opening lines emphasize that Gilgamesh possessed comprehensive knowledge, describing him as one who saw everything, learned all things, and understood all mysteries. This wisdom encompasses both practical knowledge useful for governance and building projects, and deeper understanding of cosmic principles and divine will. The combination of physical prowess with intellectual capabilities creates a complete heroic ideal that influenced subsequent concepts of ideal kingship throughout Mesopotamian civilization. Archaeological excavations at Uruk have revealed the extensive temple complex of Eanna, dedicated to the goddess Inanna and mentioned prominently in the Gilgamesh epic. The temple district, occupying a substantial portion of the ancient city, demonstrates architectural sophistication and urban planning that corresponds with the epic's descriptions of Gilgamesh's building achievements. Excavations conducted throughout the 20th century uncovered multiple construction phases dating from the Uruk period through later rebuilding efforts. The Eanna complex represents one of the most intensively studied archaeological sites in Mesopotamia, with systematic excavations beginning in 1912 under German archaeologist Julius Jordan and continuing with interruptions through the present day. These investigations have revealed a sacred precinct covering approximately 9 hectares in the heart of ancient Uruk, containing multiple temple buildings, ceremonial courtyards, and administrative structures that served the goddess Inanna's cult. The architectural remains document continuous religious activity at the site spanning over 3,000 years, though determining which specific construction phases might date to Gilgamesh's reign remains challenging. The earliest substantial architectural remains at Eanna date to the late Uruk period around 3400 BC, slightly predating the traditional chronology for Gilgamesh's reign. These early structures demonstrate remarkable architectural innovation, including the use of cone mosaics, decorative elements created by pressing coloured clay cones into mud plaster to create geometric patterns. The labour investment required to produce and install millions of these cones indicates substantial resources devoted to temple decoration, reflecting the central importance of the Inanna cult in Uruk's religious and economic life. The White Temple and the associated platform structure represent particularly significant architectural achievements from the late Uruk period. The temple building itself measures approximately 22 metres by 17 metres and stands atop a massive platform that elevates it approximately 13 metres above the surrounding plain. The platform's construction required moving enormous quantities of earth and creating a stable elevated foundation capable of supporting the temple's weight. The architectural sophistication demonstrated in this complex includes drainage systems to prevent water damage, planned access routes, and careful orientation that aligns the temple with cardinal directions and significant astronomical phenomena. The evolution of temple architecture at Eanna through successive construction phases demonstrates changing religious practices and architectural technologies. The early dynastic period, when Gilgamesh would have ruled if he was indeed a historical figure, saw major building programs that modified and expanded the temple complex. Archaeological evidence from this period includes new temple structures, renovated courtyards, and administrative buildings that house the bureaucratic apparatus managing the temple's extensive economic activities. The scale of these construction projects indicates centralized authority, capable of mobilizing substantial labor forces and coordinating complex building programs. The administrative archives discovered at Eanna provide crucial context for understanding the temple complex's role in Uruk's economy and society. Thousands of cuneiform tablets document economic transactions, including agricultural production, livestock management, textile manufacturing, and trade activities conducted under temple authority. These texts reveal that Eanna functioned not merely as a religious centre, but as a major economic institution controlling substantial resources and employing large numbers of workers in various capacities. The integration of religious and economic functions in temple complexes represents a fundamental feature of Mesopotamian urban civilization. The relationship between Gilgamesh and the goddess Inanna described in the epic takes on additional significance when considered alongside archaeological evidence for the Eanna complex's importance. The epic's account of Gilgamesh rejecting Inanna's romantic advances reflects tensions between royal and divine authority that would have real political dimensions in a society where temples controlled substantial economic resources. The king's relationship with major cults involved complex negotiations balancing religious obligations with political authority, creating dynamics that the epic explores through mythological narrative. The artistic decoration and architectural features of Eanna temples include elements that appear in the epic's descriptions of sacred spaces and divine encounters. Elaborate facade decorations employed coloured stone inlays, sculptural reliefs, and architectural mouldings that created visually impressive ceremonial environments. The temple's interior chambers contained cult statues and ritual equipment that facilitated communication between worshippers and deities. The investment in architectural magnificence and ritual elaboration demonstrates the central importance of maintaining proper relationships with divine powers who were believed to determine a city's prosperity and security. The urban planning that integrated Iana into Uruk's overall layout demonstrates sophisticated design principles that balanced religious, residential, commercial, and defensive requirements. The temple complex occupied a central position within the city's defensive walls, providing symbolic focus while also serving practical functions as administrative center and economic hub. The relationship between sacred and secular architecture, the organization of residential districts around major institutional complexes, and the integration of defensive works with urban infrastructure all reflect planning capabilities that required centralized authority and technical expertise. The preservation and transmission of the Gilgamesh epic across nearly 2 millennia required sophisticated literacy systems and institutional frameworks for maintaining textual traditions. The evolution from Sumerian to Akkadian versions demonstrates how scribal schools systematically updated and standardized literary works while preserving core narrative elements. The 12-tablet standard version from Ashurbanipal's library represents the culmination of this process, showing editorial refinement that maintained consistency across multiple copies. The development of cuneiform writing itself represents one of humanity's most significant intellectual achievements, creating capabilities for precise information, storage and transmission that fundamentally transformed social organization. The earliest cuneiform texts from Uruk, dating to approximately 3200 BC, served primarily accounting functions, recording economic transactions using simplified pictographic signs that represented concrete objects and quantities. The evolution from these accounting records to the complex writing system capable of expressing abstract concepts and literary narratives required centuries of innovation, involving sign standardization, development of phonetic representation, and creation of grammatical markers. Scribal education in ancient Mesopotamia followed systematic curricula that transformed young students into literate professionals capable of complex textual production and interpretation. The training process typically began in early childhood and extended over many years, requiring memorization of hundreds of cuneiform signs, mastery of Sumerian and Akkadian languages, and familiarity with various textual genres including legal documents, administrative records, religious texts, and literary compositions. The Gilgamesh epic served as an educational text in scribal schools, with students copying portions as writing exercises that simultaneously taught literacy skills and transmitted cultural knowledge. The physical organization of scribal schools, known as tablet houses or adubba in Sumerian, created institutional frameworks for preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. These schools operated within temple complexes or as independent institutions supported by wealthy families seeking education for their children. The schools maintained reference libraries containing standard versions of important texts that students copied as part of their training. The preservation of multiple copies of the same text in different scribal school libraries created redundancy that enhanced the likelihood of a long-term textual survival. The standardization of the Gilgamesh narrative into a 12-tablet version represents editorial work that synthesized various earlier traditions into a coherent unified composition. This standard version, attributed to a scholar named Sinleki-Unnini, who may have lived during the Middle Babylonian period around 1300 BC, established canonical form and content that subsequent scribes reproduced with remarkable consistency. The division into 12 tablets created manageable units for copying and storage, while also providing organizational structure that facilitated navigation of the complete narrative. The colophons appended to many cuneiform tablets provide crucial information about textual transmission and scribal practices. These scribal notes typically identify the tablet's content, specify its position within a larger series, name the scribe who copied it, and sometimes include the source text used for copying. The colophons on Gilgamesh tablets from Ashurbanipal's library indicate that scribes consulted multiple source texts when creating their copies, comparing different versions to ensure accuracy. This scholarly rigor in textual transmission reflects high standards for maintaining literary heritage. The multilingual nature of Mesopotamian scribal culture created additional complexity in textual transmission. The Gilgamesh tradition originated in Sumerian but achieved its most complete form in Akkadian, requiring translation that involved more than simple linguistic conversion. Translators made interpretive decisions about how to render Sumerian concepts and literary devices in Akkadian, sometimes adding explanatory material or adapting elements to reflect changing cultural contexts. Despite these transformations, the core narrative elements remained remarkably stable across linguistic and temporal boundaries. The physical characteristics of cuneiform tablets influenced how texts were composed and transmitted. Clay tablets offered advantages including low material cost and durability when properly fired or stored in dry conditions, but they also imposed constraints including limited surface area and vulnerability to breakage. Longer compositions required multiple tablets, creating series that needed careful organization and cataloguing to ensure all parts remained accessible. The tablet format also influenced literary style, with natural breaking points at tablet endings sometimes affecting narrative structure. The discovery and decipherment of cuneiform texts during the 19th century represented a triumph of scholarly persistence that opened ancient Mesopotamian civilization to modern understanding. The decipherment process built upon multilingual inscriptions, particularly the Behistun inscription in Iran, which presented the same text in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform. Scholars including Georg Friedrich Grotefend, Henry Rawlinson, and Edward Hincks gradually cracked the cuneiform code through systematic comparison of known and unknown scripts, enabling translation of texts that had been unreadable for over 2,000 years. The Gilgamesh epic articulates fundamental principles of Mesopotamian kingship that influenced political ideology throughout ancient Near Eastern civilization. The text presents the ideal king as possessing both wisdom and strength, serving as mediator between gods and humans, undertaking great building projects for the benefit of the city, and defending the population against external threats. Gilgamesh embodies these qualities while also demonstrating the dangers of excessive royal power. The dual emphasis on wisdom and strength as essential royal qualities reflects practical requirements for effective kingship in ancient Mesopotamian society. Military capability remained crucial for defending cities against external enemies and for conducting expeditions to obtain essential resources from distant regions. Wisdom encompassed both practical administrative competence needed to manage complex urban economies and deeper understanding of divine will necessary for maintaining proper relationships with supernatural powers. The ideal king needed to excel in both domains, combining warrior prowess with intellectual and spiritual capabilities. The king's role as mediator between divine and human realms receives consistent emphasis in Mesopotamian political ideology and religious practice. Kings performed essential ritual functions including temple construction, sacrifice offerings, and participation in religious festivals that maintained cosmic order and ensured divine favour for their cities. The New Year festivals celebrated throughout Mesopotamia included ritual dramas where kings enacted mythological narratives, symbolically renewing their divine mandate and securing continued prosperity. This ritual mediation required kings to understand complex religious traditions and to maintain proper relationships with priesthoods who controlled access to sacred knowledge. The building projects attributed to Gilgamesh in the epic exemplify how monumental construction served as expression of royal power and service to the community. City walls provided essential defensive capabilities while also serving as visible monuments to royal achievement. Temple construction honoured the gods while creating employment and demonstrating the king's ability to mobilise resources for collective benefit. Irrigation works and other infrastructure projects enhanced agricultural productivity, supporting larger populations and generating economic surplus. These building activities created lasting legacies that justified royal authority through tangible improvements to urban life. The limitations and dangers of royal power receive attention in the epic through its initial portrayal of Gilgamesh as an oppressive ruler whose excesses prompted divine intervention. The text describes how Gilgamesh exhausted Uruk's young men through excessive building projects and exploited his royal prerogatives in ways that caused suffering among his subjects. The citizens' complaints to the gods about Gilgamesh's behaviour led to Enkidu's creation as a counterbalance to the king's power. This narrative element acknowledges that royal authority required moderation and that excessive power could provoke resistance from both human and divine sources. The transformation of Gilgamesh from oppressive to ideal ruler provides a narrative of political education that articulates how kings should mature into their responsibilities. The friendship with Enkidu civilizes Gilgamesh's raw power, directing his energy toward appropriate goals including monster slaying and resource acquisition that benefit the community rather than merely satisfying personal ambition. The quest for immortality following Enkidu's death represents the king grappling with fundamental questions about mortality and legacy that ultimately lead to wisdom about how mortal rulers should seek fame through lasting achievements rather than impossible transcendence of death. The relationship between kings and divine beings described in Mesopotamian texts, including the Gilgamesh epic, reveals complex dynamics involving both cooperation and potential conflict. Gods granted kingship and supported rulers who properly fulfilled their obligations, but could also withdraw favour or directly punish kings who violated divine will. This conditional nature of divine support created accountability mechanisms that theoretically constrained royal power. Though practical enforcement depended on priesthoods interpreting divine will and populations willing to support resistance against oppressive rulers, archaeological artifacts from the early dynastic period provide visual confirmation of the cultural context described in the Gilgamesh epic. The Standard of Ur, discovered by British archaeologist Leonard Woolley during excavations of the Royal Cemetery at Ur between 1922 and 1934, depicts warfare, banqueting, and royal ceremony in elaborate mosaic panels. Dating to approximately 2600 BC, roughly contemporary with Gilgamesh's traditional reign, the Standard provides unprecedented visual documentation of early dynastic Mesopotamian society. The Standard of Ur consists of a wooden box approximately 50 centimetres long and 20 centimetres high, decorated on its four faces with intricate mosaic scenes created from shell, red limestone and lapis lazuli inlaid into bitumen. The two main panels, designated the war side and the peace side by modern scholars, present complementary scenes of military campaign and victory celebration. The preservation of this elaborate artifact in the burial context of the royal cemetery demonstrates the importance early dynastic elites placed on displaying their power and accomplishments through artistic representation. The warside panel depicts military action in three horizontal registers that narrate a sequence from initial combat through the taking of prisoners to the presentation of captives before the king. The bottom register shows chariots trampling enemy soldiers while infantry advances with spears. The middle register depicts the parade of prisoners being led away from the battlefield. The top register presents these captives being brought before the seated king, who receives them while attendants stand ready with weapons and supplies. This narrative structure demonstrates sophisticated artistic techniques for conveying temporal sequence and hierarchical relationships through spatial organization. The military equipment and tactics depicted on the war side provide crucial evidence for understanding early dynastic warfare. The The chariots shown in the bottom register represent early four-wheeled vehicles pulled by onagers, the wild asses native to the region, that were used before horse domestication reached Mesopotamia. These vehicles carried a driver and a warrior armed with spears, creating mobile platforms that could break enemy formations and pursue fleeing opponents. The depiction of these chariots provides our earliest detailed visual evidence for their use in Mesopotamian warfare. The infantry depicted on the standard wear long cloaks and carry spears, presenting an image of organised military forces rather than chaotic individual combat. The uniformity of their appearance and their organised formation suggest disciplined military units that fought according to coordinated tactics. This level of military organisation required training systems, command structures, and logistical support that indicate sophisticated state institutions capable of maintaining professional or semi-professional armed forces. The peace side panel depicts a banquet scene where the king and his nobles celebrate victory, while musicians and servants provide entertainment and refreshments. The top register shows the king larger than other figures, seated on an elaborate chair while holding a cup and conversing with nobles who are also drinking. The middle register presents animals and goods being brought to the banquet, including cattle, goats, and fish. The bottom register shows additional servants carrying supplies and leading animals, creating a comprehensive picture of the resources mobilized to support royal ceremony. The artistic conventions employed in the standard, including the use of hierarchical scaling, where important figures appear larger than subordinates, the arrangement of scenes in horizontal registers, and the combination of profile and frontal views establish patterns that would characterize Mesopotamian art for millennia. These conventions served both aesthetic and communicative functions, creating visually balanced compositions while clearly indicating social relationships and narrative sequences. The epic's references to Gilgamesh's building achievements include hydraulic engineering projects that correspond with archaeological evidence for sophisticated water management systems in ancient Uruk. Excavations have revealed extensive canal networks, drainage systems, and water storage facilities that required advanced engineering knowledge and organizational capabilities. These systems enabled urban populations of unprecedented size by ensuring reliable water supply for domestic use, agriculture, and industrial activities. The development of complex hydraulic infrastructure represents one of the fundamental achievements that enabled Mesopotamian urban civilization to flourish in an environment that presented significant water management challenges. The region's geography created contradictory problems requiring sophisticated engineering solutions. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers provided essential water resources, but flooded unpredictably, sometimes devastating agricultural land and settlements. During dry seasons, water levels dropped dramatically, requiring irrigation to maintain agricultural production. The successful management of these water resources through canal systems, reservoirs, and drainage networks distinguished advanced urban centres from simpler agricultural settlements. Archaeological investigation of Uruk's water management systems reveals engineering capabilities that required detailed understanding of hydraulic principles, accurate surveying techniques, and organizational capacity to coordinate large-scale construction projects. The canal networks that brought water from the Euphrates River to the city and surrounding agricultural areas extended for many kilometres, maintaining precise gradients that ensured proper flow rates without excessive erosion or sedimentation. The engineering calculations required for designing these canals demonstrate sophisticated mathematical knowledge and practical experience with water flow dynamics. The urban drainage systems discovered at Uruk represent equally impressive achievements that address challenges of removing wastewater and preventing flooding within the densely populated city. Archaeological excavations have revealed ceramic pipe networks, stone-lined drainage channels, and covered sewers that collected runoff from streets and buildings and directed it toward disposal points outside residential areas. The construction of these underground systems required careful planning to ensure proper slopes, adequate capacity for peak flow events, and accessibility for maintenance when blockages occurred. The integration of water supply and drainage systems into Uruk's overall urban planning demonstrates a comprehensive approach to infrastructure development. Major buildings, including temples and palaces, incorporated sophisticated water features, including fountains, bathing facilities, and ritual purification pools that required reliable water delivery and waste removal. The archaeological evidence suggests that these water systems were not afterthoughts added to existing buildings, but integral components considered during initial design and construction phases. The labour investment required for constructing and maintaining Uruk's hydraulic infrastructure indicates centralised authority capable of mobilising substantial workforces over extended periods. The excavation of canals involved moving enormous quantities of earth, often through difficult terrain. The construction of durable water channels required manufacturing and installing ceramic pipes, or shaping stone elements to precise specifications. The ongoing maintenance of these systems demanded regular inspection, cleaning, and repair activities that required dedicated personnel and administrative oversight. The agricultural implications of sophisticated water management extended far beyond the city itself to encompass extensive irrigation networks that transformed the surrounding landscape. The canal systems that served Uruk's agricultural hinterland enabled multiple cropping cycles annually, dramatically increasing food production capacity. The reliable irrigation allowed cultivation of lands that would otherwise remain too dry for agriculture, expanding the total area under production. These agricultural improvements generated economic surplus that supported urban populations, including craftsmen, priests, administrators, and other specialists who did not produce their own food. The technical knowledge required for effective hydraulic engineering included understanding of water flow rates, soil erosion patterns, sedimentation processes, and structural requirements for durable construction in wet conditions. Mesopotamian engineering texts from later periods preserved detailed instructions for canal construction, maintenance procedures, and calculations for optimal dimensions based on expected water volumes. While these technical manuals post-date Gilgamesh's era, they likely codify knowledge and practices that developed during earlier periods when major hydraulic systems were first constructed. The epic contains numerous references to metal objects and metallurgical processes that demonstrate advanced technological knowledge. Descriptions of weapons, tools, and ceremonial objects specify materials including bronze, copper, gold, and silver, along with manufacturing techniques that produced items of exceptional quality. The weapons carried by Gilgamesh and Enkidu on their journey to the cedar forest are described with precise details about weight, construction, and decorative elements. The development of metallurgy represents a crucial technological transition that fundamentally transformed human capabilities in tool-making, warfare, and artistic expression. The progression from simple copper working to sophisticated bronze alloys required accumulated knowledge about ore identification, extraction techniques, smelting temperatures, alloying ratios, and casting or forging methods. The appearance of advanced metallurgical knowledge in the Gilgamesh epic indicates that early dynastic Mesopotamian civilization had achieved substantial sophistication in metalworking technologies. The weapons described in the epic demonstrate particular attention to metallurgical detail that suggests familiarity with actual weapon manufacturing. The text specifies that Gilgamesh's axe weighed several talents, a measurement indicating extraordinary mass that only someone of exceptional strength could wield effectively. While this specification exaggerates capabilities to heroic proportions, it maintains plausible reference to actual weapon characteristics. Bronze axes from the early dynastic period discovered in archaeological contexts demonstrate the sophisticated casting techniques required to produce functional weapons that combined effective cutting edges with structural integrity sufficient to withstand combat stresses. The epic's description of weapon decoration, including inlaid precious materials and elaborate surface treatments, corresponds with actual practices documented in archaeological finds. Elite weapons from the period often featured gold or silver inlay work, carved decorative elements, and inscriptions identifying the owner or commemorating significant achievements. These decorative treatments served both aesthetic and status signalling functions, distinguishing prestigious weapons carried by kings and nobles from utilitarian arms used by common soldiers. The manufacturing techniques required for producing the metal objects described in the epic included lost wax casting, a sophisticated process that enabled creation of complex three-dimensional forms. This technique involved creating a wax model of the desired object, encasing it in clay, heating the assembly to melt and drain the wax, then pouring molten metal into the resulting cavity. After cooling, the clay mold was broken away to reveal the finished metal object. The precision and detail achievable through lost wax casting made it ideal for producing ceremonial objects, decorative elements, and complex mechanical components. The alloying of copper with tin to produce bronze represents a crucial metallurgical innovation that required understanding that combining specific metals in proper proportions created material with superior properties. Bronze offers advantages over pure copper, including greater hardness, better edge retention for cutting tools and weapons, and improved casting characteristics that enable production of more complex forms. The optimal ratio of approximately 90% copper to 10%. Tin produces bronze with ideal properties for most applications, though ancient metallurgists sometimes varied proportions to achieve specific characteristics for particular purposes. The sources of metals mentioned in the epic provide insight into trade networks that connected Mesopotamian cities with distant resource regions. Copper ores could be obtained from relatively nearby sources, including regions of modern Turkey and Iran, though the highest quality copper came from more distant locations, including Cyprus and Oman. Tin sources presented greater challenges, with major deposits located in regions far from Mesopotamia, including Afghanistan and possibly Southeast Asia. The procurement of tin required extensive trade networks that connected Mesopotamian urban centres with distant suppliers through chains of intermediaries. Gold and silver, mentioned frequently in the epic, served primarily ceremonial and decorative functions rather than practical applications. Both metals occur naturally in relatively pure form, simplifying their processing compared to copper or tin, which require smelting from ores. The malleability of gold and silver enabled creation of elaborate decorative works, including jewellery, vessel decorations, and architectural elements that demonstrated wealth and artistic sophistication. The epic's references to gold and silver offerings, decorative objects, and royal treasures reflect the actual importance these precious metals held in Mesopotamian society. The epic's descriptions of Gilgamesh's journey to find Utnapishtim include passages through various cosmological regions that reflect sophisticated Mesopotamian understanding of geography and the structure of reality. The text describes crossing waters of death, traversing mountains where the sun rises and sets, and navigating through regions of complete darkness. These geographical descriptions combine actual topographical knowledge of distant regions with cosmological concepts about the structure of the universe. The journey to reach Utnapishtim requires Gilgamesh to travel beyond the boundaries of the normal inhabited world into regions where ordinary humans cannot survive. The epic's description of this journey employs geographical imagery that operates on multiple levels, incorporating both actual knowledge of distant lands and symbolic representation of the boundary between mortal and immortal realms. The precision of certain geographical details suggests the narrative draws on actual exploration accounts and trade route knowledge, while other elements clearly represent cosmological concepts rather than literal geography. The crossing of the waters of death represents a crucial threshold that separates the living world from the realm where Utnapishtim dwells. The epic describes these waters as possessing deadly properties that would kill any ordinary person who touches them, requiring Gilgamesh to cross by boat while avoiding any contact with the lethal liquid. The ferryman Urshanabi, who normally transports the worthy dead across these waters, agrees to help Gilgamesh after the hero accidentally destroys the stone objects that normally protect the ferryman during crossings. This forces Gilgamesh to propel the boat using punting poles that he discards after single use to avoid contamination from the deadly waters. The practical details of the crossing procedure, including the manufacture of numerous punting poles and the careful technique required to avoid water contact, ground this supernatural barrier in realistic nautical procedures. Ancient Mesopotamian boat operators would have been familiar with various water crossing techniques and the precautions necessary when navigating dangerous waters. The epic transforms ordinary boating challenges into mythological obstacles while maintaining enough practical detail to create vivid imagery. The mountains where the sun rises and sets represent the cosmic boundaries that ancient Mesopotamians believed enclosed the habitable world. The text describes these mountains as the dwelling place of supernatural beings called scorpion people, who guard the gateway through which the sun passes each night to return from west to east for the next day's journey. The scorpion people initially challenge Gilgamesh's right to pass through their guarded territory, but recognize his partial divine nature and allow him to proceed through the tunnel beneath the mountains. The journey through the mountain tunnel constitutes one of the epic's most striking cosmological passages. The text describes Gilgamesh travelling through complete darkness for 12 double hours, the Mesopotamian measurement equivalent to 24 modern hours, before emerging into the divine garden on the far side. The precise specification of the journey's duration and the description of absolute darkness that allows no vision whatsoever create a powerful image of Gilgamesh's determination to continue, despite the impossibility of knowing whether the tunnel leads anywhere or extends forever into darkness. The divine garden that Gilgamesh discovers upon emerging from the tunnel represents a paradisiacal realm where trees bear precious stones as fruit. The text describes trees with lapis lazuli foliage, carnelian fruits, and branches of other precious materials. This imagery combines actual knowledge of valuable materials imported from distant regions with mythological concepts of divine abundance and perfection. The garden's location at the cosmic boundary places it in a liminal zone between earthly and divine realms, appropriate for Gilgamesh's transition toward his encounter with immortality. The alewife Siduri, whom Gilgamesh meets in this divine realm, initially attempts to dissuade him from continuing his quest, offering advice that reflects conventional wisdom about accepting mortality and enjoying life's pleasures while they last. Her dwelling at the edge of the world and her role providing counsel to the questing hero parallel various threshold guardian figures found in mythological traditions worldwide. Her initial fear of Gilgamesh's wild appearance following his long journey and her eventual assistance after hearing his story demonstrate patterns of challenge and aid that structure many hero journey narratives. The geographical precision of certain details in Gilgamesh's journey suggests the epic incorporates knowledge from actual long-distance travel. The descriptions of changing terrain, the navigation by celestial markers, and the encounters with unfamiliar peoples correspond with challenges that real ancient travellers faced when venturing beyond familiar territories. The epic's transformation of these practical travel accounts into cosmological journey creates a narrative that operates simultaneously as adventure story and as philosophical exploration of mortality's boundaries. The Gilgamesh tradition influenced subsequent literary and cultural developments throughout the ancient world and beyond. Elements of the epic appear in later Greek literature, particularly in Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, suggesting cultural transmission through trade networks and diplomatic contacts. The flood narrative's parallels with biblical accounts indicate either direct textual influence or preservation of common traditions through multiple cultural channels. The similarities between Gilgamesh and various Greek heroes, including Heracles and Odysseus, extend beyond superficial parallels to include specific narrative elements and thematic concerns that suggest direct cultural transmission rather than independent development. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu parallels the Greek tradition of heroic companionship exemplified by Achilles and Patroclus. The quest for immortality undertaken by Gilgamesh finds echoes in Greek heroes' journeys to the underworld or quests for immortality-granting objects. The monsters defeated by Gilgamesh resemble creatures encountered by Greek heroes, in both their supernatural characteristics and their roles as guardians of valuable resources. The flood narrative preserved in Tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh epic presents the most dramatic example of shared traditions across cultures. The story's extensive parallels with the biblical flood account in Genesis include the divine decision to destroy humanity, the selection of a righteous survivor, detailed boat construction instructions, the preservation of animal species, the sending of birds to test for receding waters, and the post-flood sacrifice that appeases divine anger. The level of detail shared between these accounts exceeds what could plausibly result from independent development, indicating either direct textual influence or preservation of common source traditions through separate cultural channels. The question of whether the biblical flood narrative derives directly from Mesopotamian sources, or whether both traditions preserve independent versions of older common traditions, remains debated among scholars. The discovery of the Gilgamesh flood account in the 19th century immediately raised questions about the biblical narrative's originality and historical accuracy. The chronological priority of the Mesopotamian version, predating the biblical text by over a millennium, established that the flood tradition existed in written form long before the composition of Genesis. However, the relationship between these texts involves complex questions about oral tradition preservation, cultural transmission mechanisms, and the nature of literary influence. The transmission of Mesopotamian literary traditions into Greek culture likely occurred through multiple channels over extended periods. Direct contact between Mesopotamian and Greek civilizations intensified during the first millennium BC, when Greek merchants and mercenaries operated extensively throughout the Near East. The establishment of Greek cities in Anatolia and the Levant created sustained opportunities for cultural exchange. The conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC brought Greek culture into direct contact with Mesopotamian intellectual traditions, leading to the establishment of schools where Greek scholars studied Mesopotamian astronomy, mathematics, and literature. The influence of Gilgamesh on later literary traditions extends beyond specific narrative borrowings to include the establishment of fundamental heroic archetypes and narrative patterns. The hero's quest for immortality and ultimate acceptance of mortality, the transformative friendship between contrasting companions, the journey beyond civilization's boundaries to confront supernatural forces, and the return home with hard-won wisdom all become recurring patterns in subsequent literature. The epic's sophisticated treatment of mortality, friendship, and the human condition established frameworks for exploring these universal concerns that influence literary traditions across cultures and millennia. Archaeological work continues to reveal new aspects of the Gilgamesh tradition and its historical context. Recent excavations at Iraqi sites have uncovered additional tablet fragments that fill gaps in the narrative and provide new insights into textual transmission. In 2003, German archaeologists reported discovering what may be Gilgamesh's tomb at an ancient site near Uruk, based on geophysical surveys that revealed structures matching literary descriptions. The discovery of new Gilgamesh fragments occurs periodically as archaeologists excavate sites throughout Iraq and Syria that housed ancient libraries and archives. Each new discovery potentially adds lines to the narrative, clarifies ambiguous passages, or reveals variant readings that illuminate how the tradition evolved across different regions and time periods. The process of integrating new fragments into existing reconstructions requires painstaking philological work, comparing handwriting, linguistic features, and narrative content to determine each fragment's position within the overall composition. The reported discovery of Gilgamesh's tomb generated significant international attention when German archaeologists announced their findings in April 2003. The team led by Jörg Fassbinder from the Bavarian Department of Historical Monuments employed magnetometry and other geophysical survey techniques to map subsurface structures at the ancient site of Uruk without conducting destructive excavation. The surveys revealed anomalies beneath the former course of the Euphrates River that the researchers interpreted as a tomb structure whose location and characteristics matched descriptions found in ancient texts referring to Gilgamesh's burial. The geophysical survey data indicated the presence of a large rectangular structure constructed from materials that produce distinctive magnetic signatures different from surrounding soil. The structure's position beneath the ancient riverbed corresponded with literary references describing Gilgamesh's tomb as located beneath diverted river waters, a burial practice documented for other ancient rulers who sought to protect their final resting places from disturbance. The survey also detected what appeared to be a series of chambers or rooms within the overall structure, suggesting a complex tomb design rather than a simple burial pit. The identification of these anomalies as Gilgamesh's actual tomb remains speculative pending excavation that would allow direct examination of the structures and any associated artifacts or inscriptions. The political instability in Iraq during the early 21st century prevented the German team from conducting follow-up excavation to confirm their interpretation. The site's location beneath the water table and within an area that has been heavily disturbed by modern agriculture and development would complicate any future excavation efforts, requiring specialized techniques to investigate waterlogged archaeological deposits. The broader context of ongoing archaeological research in Iraq faces severe challenges resulting from decades of conflict, looting, and destruction of cultural heritage. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad suffered extensive looting during the chaos following the 2003 invasion, resulting in the loss of thousands of artifacts including cuneiform tablets and other materials crucial for understanding Mesopotamian civilization. International efforts to recover looted materials and to document surviving collections continue, though the scale of losses and ongoing security concerns limit what can be accomplished. Despite these challenges, archaeological research on Gilgamesh and early dynastic Mesopotamian civilization continues through various channels. Institutions holding cuneiform tablet collections work to digitize their holdings, creating online databases that make texts accessible to researchers worldwide. Advanced imaging techniques, including reflectance transformation imaging, allow scholars to read previously illegible portions of damaged tablets, potentially recovering lost passages. The application of new analytical methods to previously excavated materials generates fresh insights without requiring new fieldwork in unstable regions. The enduring fascination with Gilgamesh reflects both the epic's literary power and its status as humanity's oldest recorded heroic narrative. The themes explored in the epic, including friendship, mortality, the quest for meaning, and the relationship between civilization and nature, remain immediately relevant to contemporary audiences, despite the vast temporal and cultural distance separating modern readers from ancient Mesopotamian society. The epic's influence continues to manifest in modern literature, film, and other artistic expressions that draw upon its archetypal characters and narrative patterns, while adapting them to contemporary contexts and concerns. The evidence presented throughout this investigation reveals that Gilgamesh represents far more than mythological invention or primitive folklore. The convergence of archaeological discoveries, cuneiform documentation, architectural remains, and cross-cultural parallels establishes him as a genuine historical figure whose achievements were systematically preserved through sophisticated literary traditions spanning nearly 2 millennia. The Epic of Gilgamesh stands as humanity's first recorded heroic narrative, yet its significance extends beyond literary firsts to encompass fundamental questions about mortality, friendship, civilization, and human purpose that remain as relevant today as when Sumerian scribes first committed these stories to clay tablets nearly 5,000 years ago. The systematic preservation of the Gilgamesh tradition through multiple cultural and linguistic transitions, demonstrates remarkable institutional continuity in ancient Mesopotamian civilization. The evolution from independent Sumerian poems through standardized Akkadian versions to the canonical 12-tablet edition found in Ashurbanipal's library reveals sophisticated editorial processes that maintained narrative coherence while adapting content to changing cultural contexts. This preservation effort required dedicated scribal schools, institutional support for literary transmission, and cultural values that prioritize maintaining connection with ancestral traditions across centuries of political upheaval and social transformation. The archaeological confirmation of details described in the epic, including the walls of Uruk, the Iana temple complex, and sophisticated hydraulic engineering systems, validates the narrative's historical foundation while demonstrating that early dynastic Mesopotamian civilization possessed technological and organizational capabilities far exceeding what simple, evolutionary models of human development would predict. The precision of architectural specifications, the accuracy of geographical descriptions, and the correspondence between literary accounts and physical remains all indicate that significant portions of the epic preserve genuine historical memory rather than pure invention. The cross-cultural influences radiating from the Gilgamesh tradition shaped literary and philosophical developments throughout the ancient world and continue to resonate in contemporary culture. The flood narrative's appearance in multiple independent traditions, the heroic archetypes established through Gilgamesh's character, and the thematic explorations of mortality and meaning influence Greek literature, biblical texts, and countless subsequent works that grapple with universal human concerns. The epic's sophisticated treatment of friendship between contrasting individuals, the tension between civilization and nature, and the ultimate acceptance of mortal limitations established narrative patterns and philosophical frameworks that transcend cultural boundaries. As archaeological research continues to reveal new dimensions of ancient Mesopotamian civilization, and as scholars apply advanced analytical techniques to previously studied materials, our understanding of the historical Gilgamesh and the society he ruled continues to evolve. The reported discovery of his tomb awaits confirmation through direct excavation, while ongoing work with cuneiform tablets promises to fill remaining gaps in the narrative and illuminate how the tradition developed across different periods and regions. These continuing revelations ensure that humanity's first recorded hero remains a living subject of investigation rather than a closed chapter of ancient history, offering fresh insights into the origins of civilization and the enduring questions that have occupied human consciousness since the earliest dawn of recorded thought. The legacy of Gilgamesh demonstrates that the fundamental concerns of human existence, the search for meaning in the face of mortality, the value of friendship and achievement, and the proper relationship between individual ambition and communal responsibility have remained constant across the millennia that separate his age from ours.